Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help you manage the thoughts and the feelings specific to your death-related loss. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Grief Refuge is about helping you find peace and purpose after loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate the thoughts and feelings related to your grief, and to help you take time to reflect and honor your self-care. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You can also find comfort, hopefulness, and a sense of peace in regards to finding a way to embrace life moving forward. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to help provide companionship, insight, and also be a soothing voice to help you navigate those heavier, more painful feelings that do go hand in hand with grief. Grief is hard and grief can be painful. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, there's just a little housekeeping to cover. The conversations held here on this podcast, they have a depth to them, and the nature is not an easy, light, joyful thing. So it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and your personal reflection. And that means to take this time to do your best to relax, to allow your grief-related feelings to run their course, and essentially, to use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes twice a month, and when you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode. Things can come up, and as they often do, you actually may feel some setbacks. You may feel confusion, overwhelm, feeling stuck, and other strong emotions that can cause more pain. So what do you do in the meantime? Well, you download the Grief Refuge app. And the reason why is the Grief Refuge app, it's a hub for getting more support. On the Grief Refuge app, you'll find stories, you'll find tips and guidance, all for navigating your grief journey. You'll also receive daily messages of validation, hope, and comfort to help soothe and comfort you throughout the difficult journey. You can download the Grief Refuge app for free from your phone's app store. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. So when you're grieving, have you ever asked yourself, who am I without my special person? Have you thought about certain things that made your relationship complicated and how that might impact your grieving process? If you've answered yes to one or both of these questions, you're going to love this guest interview with my good friend Kate Burns. Kate and I don't know each other well, but there's so many commonalities, we kind of feel like grief soulmates. On today's Grief Refuge podcast, Kate opens up to share some of the hard truths about the loss of her mother and the journey she's embarked on to embrace her self-identity that comes from within. I am deeply touched by and grateful for Kate's vulnerability, honesty, and insightfulness. What you're about to hear is a deep conversation that makes you think about the many complications we encounter in a relationship, even more so with someone who suffers from an addiction. Please enjoy my conversation with Kate. Hey, Kate, thanks for joining us on Grief Refuge.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Hey, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Have you ever actually listened to a Grief Refuge episode before?
I listened to one on my way home today, and that was my first, and I'm definitely going to come back for more.
Oh, well, I appreciate the compliment. But I was very curious if, because a lot of people that are guests on Grief Refuge, their first episode they listen to is their own.
Oh, wow. I mean, I can understand that though, right? Like sometimes hearing other people's grief stories can be really overwhelming. I think, especially if you're going through grief in the moment, a lot of people will find podcasts because they're going through something. But then sometimes people meet like we did through podcasting, and you go out in search of other resources. So this is definitely on my list now to kind of refer people over to your podcast and your app for sure, as they're experiencing deep loss.
I appreciate that. And I'm also, for lack of a better word, I actually truly am excited that we're having this conversation to share on Grief Refuge podcast, because it's really important. And in all of the resources, and I mean a lot, all of the resources I've looked at, I actually don't think that there is a podcast episode or yet to be an article in regards to the topic that you and I are going to discuss today. And so for our listeners, can you share a little bit about where you're at currently with your grief?
Yeah, definitely. I am pretty still, I would say, deep in my grief. It will shockingly be 3 years in March from when I lost my mom. My mom was 64 when she died, and it was very sudden. And so, I think I'm sure we'll get into kind of the backstory of that, but I think the relationship that she and I had, really all through my life, which was one of kind of a tug of war, a push and pull. I think that's probably the reason that I'm still so deep in it. But I say deep in it, not like I feel like I'm drowning, but deep in it in terms of self-exploration and kind of trying to understand myself in it. I don't cry nearly as often. When I cry, it's usually, on a holiday, or actually yesterday would have been her 67th birthday. And so, it's more so those kind of big occasions, those big events that she's not here for. That's typically when I feel the urge to cry, and obviously do let it out because I know that's good for me. But in terms of my grief journey, I've channeled a lot of energy into, my own podcast work. I am a board member on the Green Burial Council, and I'm studying to be a death doula as well. So I channeled a lot of the grief that I had and still have into some kind of productive measures. It took me a little while to get there and kind of figure out that would be helpful for me, but that's where I'm at.
I appreciate you sharing that. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're, in my projection, there's achieving a sense of purpose in serving others as part of some of your own personal healing and your personal grief journey. And I resonate with that. That's pretty much how Grief Refuge got started. I'm also curious, you mentioned some tidbits about the crying. And so I would say that crying is an expression of mourning, mourning being the, grief gone public, grieving being the thoughts and the feelings. And so I was wondering, are there any other forms of expression that are active in your life to mourn the loss of your mother?
Absolutely. So I am a huge, huge, huge believer in therapy. I have been with my therapist for about 9 years now. I got very, very lucky in that he was kind of the first person that I went to in my adult life, and we just really clicked. We hit it off. And so therapy has been a very significant factor in kind of moving through my grief. I also have done a lot of writing, just on the notes app on my phone. Sometimes something will just hit me and I'll pull out the note that I just labeled grief, and I will pull it up and just write whatever's in my brain. I've found that that's something that really helps me to move forward with my day while honoring whatever it was that came into my mind. But it lets me get it out and come back to it later if I want to, because you never know when grief is going to strike. You can be in the middle of I do a lot of training and presenting at work, and I can be in the middle of it. And though I don't normally whip out my phone right then, If there's a break or something, I'll just go out and put it there so that I can have it there without forgetting, but it allows me to kind of move forward. On top of that, the podcasting that I do, so I found the Death Dialogues Project through my grief journey. It was probably a couple months after my mom died. I was desperately looking for resources that could make me feel, I guess, heard and validated. Even though I wasn't yet a guest on the podcast, it was something that I really, really needed, because what I appreciated about this podcast was it was people talking about the complication of relationships and complications of their grief through complicated relationships, where a lot of the resources that I was finding, people would just talk about how wonderful and perfect and amazing and brilliant their dead person was. And I was like, but what about the complication of my grief because of the complicated relationship that I had with my mom? I only knew one other person who was close to my age. I was 30 or 31 when my mom died. And that's like a weird age group to be in, to have a dead parent, because, there's tons of resources for little kids whose parents die, and there's tons of resources for older people, because you think about like advanced disease, dementia, here are the ways you can help with this. But people in their like 30s, late 20s, there's just not a lot out there for us. And then to add the complication on, there wasn't much. And so podcasting is something that I found, or I guess listening to podcasts, that one in particular, the Death Dialogues Project, that was really helpful, because it made me feel like I wasn't so isolated. And though, I had my husband and my family to talk to, it wasn't really the same. And so hearing other people talk about their relationships with their loved ones who had died and how they moved through that was really powerful for me, because there were days that I truly felt I wasn't going to survive the grief. Some days, one day in particular, I remember just laying in bed. I started crying in the shower, and I got out of the shower and just laid in bed and just cried until my whole body ached, and nothing would make it go away. And so I just remember thinking, like, I can't go on like this. And so finding that podcast really helped. And then subsequently becoming a guest on the podcast, kind of talking through some of that, was very cathartic, very therapeutic. And then, down the road, as I kind of linked up with Becky Odd-Jennison, who started that podcast, we got to talking, and she and I decided I would become an interviewer on the podcast. And so, I think in a way, interviewing people about their grief has helped me in a lot of different ways, and helped me kind of understand a little bit more of my grief. So that was a very long answer to your question, but I've really utilized a whole bunch of different ways to help me work through some of that. Yes, hopefully all healthy. I think most of them in very healthy ways. So
yeah, indeed you have. And it's very well articulated. I really appreciate you sharing so much. To me, it really sounds like we use the word honor a lot in supporting others in grief. And it's not just a term that is specifically geared towards military, because I know that in military, honoring is an active word used. But in honoring, it's from my definition of it, I would say it's like holding space for your own grief. It's like also giving attention to what grief presents to you, because sometimes I'm like, grief could almost be like the unwanted companion that shows up, because if you turn your back to it, it now becomes your shadow. Mm-hmm. But when you face it, it becomes like sometimes a painful and sometimes a beautiful mirror to yourself, some of your inner experiences. And so I'm so curious, Kate, have you always given this much attention to your grief process, or have you seen an evolution?
That's a good question. Are you talking about with my mom or other deaths that I've experienced?
Great distinction. Well, I guess it's time to talk about your mom. Let's start with her.
Okay.
your grief with your mom?
So there's a little bit of backstory here with my relationship with my mom. My parents got divorced when I was 3, and I primarily lived with my mom and my sister. My sister's about 3 years older than me. And, for as long as I can remember, I just always thought that my mom didn't like the nighttime. She always seemed to get really mad at night and was pretty mean sometimes. And, as you grow up, the things that your parents do and the things that you're subjected to on a daily basis are your norm. Other things are that's other people's stuff. So I just knew that my mom was mad at night. I spent one night a week at my dad's house, and that's all. And so it wasn't until I was in about, I want to say it was 8th grade, that I had said something to my sister about mom not liking nighttime and just being mad all the time. And she's like, "Are you stupid? She's drunk." And I was like, "What? No, she's not. Like, mom doesn't do that. Like, that's other people's stuff." And the older I got, the more I paid attention, the more I watched how much alcohol she drank at night, the more I realized that it was true. She was a functioning alcoholic. During the day, she held down a job. She, on the weekends during the day, she, came to our sporting events. She came to our concerts. She came to all of our activities, and she was our biggest supporter. She was the best mom I could have asked for. At night, again, like I said, she got really mean and nasty. So I think a big part of my story here is that, growing up in that kind of environment, it really made me question my own identity. I didn't have an identity, it didn't feel like, because I wasn't sure if I was, a good kid or a bad kid. Because during the day, I remember she would drop me off at school in the morning, and there was a specific stop sign where she would give me a hug and a kiss and say, "You're smart and beautiful," and send me on my way to school. And I loved that. That's such a fond memory that I have. And then I'd get home from school, she'd get home from work, we'd have a couple of good hours, and then all of a sudden, I wasn't good enough. My room wasn't clean enough. I wasn't smart enough. Like, it was very confusing to come up in an environment like that. And so, moving into the high school years, it was really challenging because all I knew was I didn't want to drink before I was 21, because I was very, very like bound to the rules, because it was like, because I couldn't control any. And of course, I'm recognizing this like 20 years later, but looking back on it, it's like, if I could control everything in my life, things would be okay, because I had no control at night. I wanted to control everything else, which caused significant problems down the road, and friendships and my marriage and all of these different aspects of my life. So what I think happened then was I became very codependent. And of course, I didn't realize that. I realized that at some point before my mom died, actually, in therapy, because of some issues going on within my marriage. I remember my therapist saying, "Are you familiar with the term codependence?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, but that's not me. Like, what are you talking about?" And so I actually read the book Codependent No More. And within that book, they talk a lot about, being raised by an addict and a lot of these things that happen. And I was like, holy crap, like, this is unbelievable, and yet so obvious at the same time. And so I had to kind of start learning to set boundaries with my mom. At one point I told her that I wasn't going to talk to her after 6 o'clock at night, because what was happening was she would call me later in the evening, and it would be purely to pick a fight because she was drunk. And so then my husband would say, "Why do you answer the phone if she's drunk and she's going to pick a fight?" Because it was every single night. And my fear was that she was going to die in her sleep. And if I didn't pick up the phone, and tell her, no matter how mad at her I was, I would tell her I loved her. Even if it was that, even if I was going to hang up on her, I would say, I love you, hang up on her. And, the kind of the light bulb moment was when my therapist asked me, if you don't talk to her before she goes to sleep and she does die in her sleep, do you think that she doesn't know that you love her? And I was like, of course she does. It took something so simple, that simple question. Of course she does. And so the way that my therapist put it was, sometimes you have to create boundaries with people in order to maintain a relationship with them. And so that's kind of what we had to do, because, at some point I was starting to get mad at my husband for saying, like, why do you even pick up the phone? Because then it would ruin our night and ruin our time together, because I would fight with her and then I'd get off the phone and cry. And he saw this very simple solution of don't answer the phone. But of course, like, I wasn't going to listen to that. It took my therapist to say that. And so that kind of started that journey of like learning about codependence. And it also started that journey of talking with him about my fear of her dying, which I felt deeply, deeply from even way back when I was a kid. There were a lot of nights that I wouldn't want to spend the night at my friend's house. If I would go to my dad's on a Friday night to spend the night, I would have to breathe into a paper bag, because if she wouldn't pick up the phone, I was just terrified of her dying. And so, I was probably 27, 28 when I started talking through these fears with my therapist and setting those boundaries with my mom. And it was fascinating, because probably, I would say, maybe 3 weeks before she died, and again, it was very sudden, like we had no idea she was going to die. My therapist and I had talked about the fact that I wanted to make sure that I remembered both sides of her, the good mom and the bad mom, the day mom and the night mom. And he said, why would you want to remember both? And I said, I don't want to make grief harder than it would be, because if I send her into martyrdom and just forget, or I guess repress the memories that I had of her when she was terrible, awful, mean, I almost think that would have made grief harder. But I also want to remember her as the great mother that she was during the day, because if nothing else, I owe her that, because she gave me a lot of good qualities. I appreciate so much about the things that she taught me. But I needed to make sure that both of those were very concrete in my mind.
Really honoring the sharing of your story and a lot of the transparency of your experiences. I guess putting myself in your shoes, there could be many years of dealing with the fears and the anxieties. And that's really tough. And I personally identify with parts of your story, having a parent who was an alcoholic himself. And so, yeah, you got the feelers coming up, Kate. And I guess I'm just going to ask about one more thing. I think earlier in our conversation, you used the word complication. And it seems like that's partly how you define your relationship with your mom.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something that grief has taught you to define as a complicated relationship, or is it something that you began to recognize before your mother's passing?
I think I started to recognize it in some way before she died, because of those boundaries that I had to set with her. Another one of the boundaries was you can't drink around my kids. She came very close to ruining Santa with them when they were really little. And I said, no more. You can't drink in my house. You can't drink around them. And so the emotional conflict that I felt, again, because she was so great when she wasn't drinking versus when she was, like, that complication and that almost like weird dichotomy, it was really hard to sort through. And so I almost, when I talk about like day mom versus night mom, I almost need to compartmentalize those two as if they were two different people. And so recognizing that complication was there was then amplified once she died, because it was this swirl of like guilt, and also recognition of guilt because I was not always nice to her. I was so mad at her when she was alive because she wasn't getting she wasn't happy. She felt like she needed to drink. It was an addiction, and I desperately wanted her to be happy. And so, but I was mad at her. So there's yet another complication. I was mad at her because she wasn't happy, which was probably in turn making her more unhappy. And so I think I started that recognition pre-death. And then after she died, I could kind of sort it out more. And actually, because those feelings toward her of anger and things like that were no longer in existence, I think I was able to sort them a little bit more cleanly, if that makes sense.
Makes sense to me. Kate, you've spoken to setting boundaries. Were you ever able to call your mom out for her behaviors?
Yep. One time, and it was probably one of the worst experiences I've ever had. It's one of those hindsight is 2020 moments. She was hospitalized in 2015 for a number of different things not related to her alcoholism. She had some fluid building up in her lungs and around her heart, and causing her issues with breathing. She was diagnosed with COPD, and I can see why my sister and I decided to have this conversation with her when we did, because it was very well, I mean, you remember, I'm very much like need that control. So it was very well planned out, very well thought out. We just kind of missed a piece of it. We sat down actually with my mom's best friend. They had been best friends since they were in 7th grade. And again, she was 64 when she died. We sat down together and talked about these things and talked about the struggles that we'd had with her, given her drinking. And we decided to confront her about it in the hospital. And my recollection of what happened is minimal because of how terrible it was. I remember a couple of things. I remember her laughing when we brought it up and saying something to the effect of, what kind of damage could I have possibly done to you? And then her saying, you know what, I like alcohol and I don't like people. And if you don't like it, you can get out of my life. And that was my final straw. I said, I couldn't give a shit less if you died in here. And I walked out of the room. I made it to the parking garage, and my sister called me crying and said, please come back. She's like, you don't even have to talk to her. Just be here for me. So I went back and just sat in the corner and didn't say another word. And something must have happened with my sister's kid or something like that to where she had to leave. And so I stayed in the room because somebody had to be there to ask questions of the doctors and things like that. And so I was the only one there when my mom was discharged. And so I ended up driving her home. So that didn't sever our relationship as I thought it would. Our relationship carried on, but she refused to talk about it. She was, to be honest with you, I think she was mad at us for the next 4 years of her life. She would drop little passive aggressive nuggets into conversation about that conversation. But then when I would try to pin her down on it, she would be like, nothing, never mind, I'm not talking about it. So very childish behavior. So yes, we confronted her about it. And the only thing the only productive conversation that we ever had about it was just how bad it hurt her that we did it while she was in the hospital, because she already felt terrible. She felt scared because she didn't know what was wrong with her. And we recognized that it wasn't the right time to do it. even though it made sense to us, it was hurtful to her how we did it. Now, I don't think it would have gone any differently had we done it while she was not in the hospital. I think it would have had the same outcome in terms of her denying that she's an alcoholic and, you know, what have you. But that piece was hurtful to her. And for that, I apologize. But I don't think she ever accepted it.
Yeah, that's painful. Again, a lot of familiarizing on my end, just from my own personal experiences with my father. I'll just share a piece that when my brother actually took more courage into confronting him, I think I was more apathetic. I just thought, damned if we do, damned if we don't. But I think for my brother's own kind of understanding his self-identity and feeling some sense of liberation, if that makes sense, within some of his emotional wounding inside of himself, he would confront my dad. And it felt like it backfired every time. And it was just hitting a brick wall of anger and spite. And that was his defense mechanisms. That was how he continued to live in denial on the surface, but also hide what he called his inner demons. And Kate, I really empathize with you as far as that struggle. I'm really hesitant to ask, but it's really speaking from my heart. So forgive me if it endures more pain, but do you now regret the experience in the hospital?
I have lived my entire life, and I believe I live very intentionally. Maybe that's a little bit about the control, but I live very intentionally trying not to regret anything. And the way that I do that, and I'm stuck to it pretty well, is to keep at the forefront of my mind why I made the decisions that I made in the moment. And I'm not going to say I fully regret doing what we did. I wish that we had the foresight to recognize how scared she was in the hospital and how bad she was already feeling. Because to be honest with you, our mindset was, she's here. She can't go anywhere. It's not like she can walk out the door. She can't get loud and angry and whatever because she's in the hospital. And she is sick. So maybe she'll listen and try to turn her life around and get healthy. When in reality, the impact of our actions was, it made her feel very isolated and alone and backed into a corner. And so I regret that was her experience. Again, I don't think that it would have had a different outcome, like if we were in her house or, you know, wherever else you do these kinds of interventions or conversations. And I don't regret having the conversation. I think I would have regretted had she died and we never had the conversation, because I want to know that I tried everything that I possibly could have to help her live a healthier life. And that was my attempt. And though it didn't work the way I wanted, it worked somewhat the way I expected.
Well, Kate, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this episode, but I just so appreciate like you sharing everything from such a transparent lens and being very authentic in your own soul and in your own heart. To me, Kate, it really makes sense about your and your sister's intentions. Because, you know, if you think about it, you're your mother's child and you care about her, and you also want to understand from a developmental perspective of being the child. And I'm assuming that there's probably many times in your life throughout the complications of the relationships where there might have been aspects of like having to parent the parent and things like that. And that's perhaps some dynamics that we can explore for another episode. But I just really want to validate you for having the will, truthfully, having the will to conjure up the courage to have that experience with your mom, regardless of the result, because I know from a child's perspective, it's also a way of saying like, hey, mom, I care about you. I love you. Like, I want what's best for you. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's weird how as we adult and learn more about the timing of things and recognize how important timing can be. And also like delivery. I used to be so much more direct in my communication, and I've learned to soften my approach.
Yes.
I give a lot of
it's hard to do.
Yeah, it is hard to do. I give a lot of credit to my wife on that one.
She's a marriage therapist or something, isn't she?
That's correct. Yeah, she has those skills. Yes.
That's great.
Kate, hey, listen, one thing it's been sitting in the front of my mind. And it feels a little bit left field. So here I am back to asking things like from a very direct manner, but I kind of feel like maybe now is the appropriate time to ask, what would you say as far as your relationship to your mom and the alcoholism specifically? What would you say is your hardest truth about the dynamic with your mom?
I would say that it was likely how challenging it was for me to form an identity. Because as we come up, our parents have such a huge impact on that. And, you think about the different psychological theories, you think about the labeling theory, you think about all of these different things. And if you're labeled one thing by your parent at one point in the day, and then the 4, 5, 6, 8 hours later, you're labeled another thing, you're not sure which it is. And, you're trying hard, and that you're still being the same kid, but like they're seeing something different. So what am I? That identity piece has been something that I struggle with to this day. I think, interestingly, kind of, you talked about the beauty that can come from grief. And I think, I've said before, her death has been the worst and the best thing that could have happened to me, because it allowed me to explore who I actually am without her input, which is hard to say out loud because it makes me feel kind of bad, but it's the truth. And that's something that, through my own podcast work, I want people to hear that. I want people to recognize that being able to explore yourself and explore your own identity outside of what anyone else, whether it's your spouse, your partner, your sibling, your parents, think you are or have labeled you as, you're the only one who gets to choose that. And I think I've been on, probably for about the last 6 or 7 years, been on this journey of who am I actually. And one of the things that my therapist asked me that I think about every single day after my mom died, and I was just in fits about, this something had happened, and I desperately wanted to call her and tell her because I wanted her to be proud of me. It was that validation piece. In that session with him, I recognized that I had never in my life, not once, been proud of myself. I derived my own pride from her pride in me. And that was no longer an option to have because she was dead. And he asked me the question, what does being proud of yourself look like? And it was like this moment of, oh my God, I have no idea what that means to me. I don't know what that feels like. It was a completely foreign concept to me to sit and think like, I don't know what that even means. And he tried to help me define it in that session. And at the end of it, he just said, this is something that you need to go out on your own and explore. And my God, was that uncomfortable. It's still kind of weird because what I was recognizing after she died, and the months after she died, I was realizing that I was trying to replace her validation with other people's validation. So every day after work, I would call her and tell her about the events of the day. If something great happened, I'd tell her about it just to hear her, as embarrassing as it is to say, hear her be proud of me, and not look within to find that. And after she died, it was like I was calling my mother-in-law, or I was calling my husband, or I was calling my friend to try to tell them that same thing. And when I wasn't getting that same reaction from them, I was like, why do I feel so bad? At first I was like, oh, it's because my mom's dead. And then after a while I was like, that's not it. It's a very ugly thing to recognize in yourself. It's very embarrassing. But, again, finding that identity in you and finding what it means to be proud of yourself, or what it means to kind of self-soothe in certain situations, has been the most freeing and liberating thing I've ever experienced.
Kate, that's really profound. Wow, I think you hit me with one of those moments. I often get these in podcast episodes where I'm like, okay, we're done. We don't need to say anything more. Like, ding, 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 ding. That's like the golden winner. Yep. Like,
yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, you just gave such a gift to the world, and everyone who listens to this.
I think people pleasing is something that so many people struggle with and have. And that, you always hear people talk about, you should only live for yourself. Your self-image should be the most important thing to you. But you know how sometimes people can tell you things, and the same person can tell you something over and over and over, and you just don't get it. And then some other person tells you and it just clicks. That was kind of that moment for me where it was like, oh my gosh, like my whole life people have been telling me, like, you have to stop trying to please other people. Like, what about you? Like, and it never clicked until she was ripped away from me. And even months later, I was still seeking something outside of myself. And when I was able to find that within myself and find that pride, and when something good happens, I don't go run to tell somebody else. I take a minute and I sit with it. It's truly just the best feeling. You don't feel like you have to tell someone. You don't feel like you need their approval or validation. And I think I'm lucky because I did learn that in my 30s. And again, that's kind of why I say her death is partially the best thing that ever happened to me, because if she lived until I was 60, I might have gone 60 years not knowing what it was like to have an identity and feel proud of myself for something. And that would have been tragic.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're able to answer the question from what your therapist asked you. What would it look like if you were proud? Or sorry, how was it phrased again? What would it look like if you were proud of yourself?
Yeah. What would being proud of yourself look like? What does
being proud of yourself look like? And so how do you answer the question specifically now?
Not needing to tell anyone. Doing my best in making other people live happier lives. And, if I receive an accolade or, I'm trying to think of achievements now. There was one moment where it was not long after she died where I received the Employee of the Month award at work, and I got like $750, and these important people read something about me, and I remember feeling really sad about it because I couldn't tell her. And now, if something like that were to happen, it's more of like, I don't need to tell anyone because that's something that I did, and it's something that I've contributed to the world, and that's enough. And for me, that's what pride is.
Kate, are you proud of yourself?
I am. And it's still weird for me to acknowledge that, but being able to kind of look back and really in the years that she has died, again, it'll be 3 years on March 20th. And just looking at the different things that I've done in that amount of time and the things that I've been able to contribute to the world, especially, through the podcast, and the things that I've learned through the different really death related things. Because, if you really boil it down, a lot of our emotions stem from the fear of death, even if it seems wholly unrelated. A lot of it boils down to death and, not accomplishing what we want to in life. And I can honestly say that I am proud of myself and the things that I've contributed to the world and hopefully to other people. And so, I definitely am.
Mm-hmm. Having been a guest on the Death Dialogues Project podcast and being interviewed by you, I can say that I'm very pleased to hear that you are proud of yourself, because I think you're talented. I think you're gifted. I think you're brilliant in thinking of questions that just help people share more of who they are. And you are bringing a gift to the world with the interviews that you facilitate on that podcast. And so you're very welcome. Thank you. Tell us a little bit more about the podcast that you work for.
Yeah, so the Death Dialogues Project podcast was started by Becky Jennison. She lives in New Zealand, and she is a wonderful, wonderful human being who really kind of, I feel like, is one of the first people to bring a voice to grief and to talk with people in such a way that makes them feel comfortable kind of sharing those icky pieces of life and those icky pieces of grief and even yourself, because you come on these podcasts and you're just kind of pouring it all out. And when I was interviewed by her, it didn't feel like I was talking to anyone but her. And I really appreciated that, because these things are hard to talk about. And she's giving so many people a platform to talk about the really hard pieces of grief. And that's really, like I said at the beginning, that's what drew me to the podcast, was we can have this conversation about the messy, ugly things, and it's okay. And when I heard those things as a griever, when I heard those, I was like, yes, yes, that's exactly how I feel. Thank you. I'm so glad someone said it, because it's things that, like, if somebody doesn't say it first, it can feel really shameful, and you can be so ashamed that you're not going to share it with anyone. And if you're not going to share it with anyone, it's going to eat you alive. And so that's why I when we started talking about me potentially interviewing on the podcast, I was like, if this is something that I can contribute, let's do it. And it's been fantastic. My God, I've learned so many things. She's actually publishing a couple of books here in the next few months. And so I've been doing a lot more of the interviews. And so she and I are actually going to record a session together here in the next couple of weeks to talk about her book. And it's been a wonderful experience to be able to talk to so many people and have them share their stories with me. It's, again, you talk about honor. I'm so honored to be able to have this gift of being able to ask questions and have people share their innermost workings, because as it can be really challenging to put yourself out there for the world to hear. And these people are so generous and being willing to come forward and share their stories.
Fantastic. I love it. So, Kate, if there is a vision for the evolution of your grief journey and how you want to intertwine it or let it influence you as you evolve as a person, and even perhaps provide service more professionally, can you give us a sneak peek into what that may be?
I would love to. I plan to keep going with the podcast, but something else that I'm doing is taking classes through Going with Grace to become a death doula. This is something that I found after my mom died. I was very clear-eyed, clear-headed as I was going through the process of planning her funeral. My sister and I were very opposite in how we grieved initially, and I guess still so. But going through and planning the funeral, and I remember asking the question of how much is this going to cost? I mean, it was like one day, maybe the same day that she died, maybe the day after that, we were at the funeral home, and the funeral director, whoever he was, said, "You don't need to worry about that right now." And I thought, are you insane? Like, what? No, it is something that we need to worry about. And then I asked, she was cremated, and I said, what size urn do we need? Like, how many pounds of ash does like a human body produce? Like, I don't know these things. And they were like, just bring whatever urn you want. And I was like, well, A, I don't want her to be left behind if I don't bring a big enough urn. And B, I don't want to like have somebody else scooped up and poured in my urn if I bring too big of an urn. So can you just answer the question? And so the lack of transparency, I'm going to try hard not to knock on the funeral industry, but the lack of transparency and the lack of willingness to provide answers was shocking to me. It was appalling. And so, through that, something that I really feel passionate about is, as I'm going through death doula school, I want to help people pre-plan. My mom didn't have a will. She didn't have anything laid out. The only thing I knew was that she wanted to be cremated. And so I am wildly passionate about helping people recognize that pre-planning is an act of love. Let your family know what you want. Death is going to happen to you, and death is not a failure. Death is what is supposed to happen. It is literally the only thing in life that's supposed to happen. And if we can pre-plan and save our loved ones the trauma of dealing with the funeral industry and being taken advantage of, and if we have these questions laid out ahead of time, we can hold more space for honoring the life that they lived, rather than filling that space with making irrational decisions very quickly. So, eventually my hope is to start a business in helping people doing some pre-planning work and helping them navigate the process that comes with funeral planning.
Awesome. Well, there's no doubt in my mind that it will not succeed. It's going to be phenomenal. I hear the passion come clearly through the words that you vocalize. Kate Burns, it's been wonderful to have you on the Grief Refuge podcast. Thank you for sharing your vulnerabilities. Thank you for sharing your passions, your powerful story, and also the incredible insights on developing your self-identity. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I am deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and our mission. We help the grieving find peace and purpose after loss. This is important work, and yes, as I said before, it's painful at times, but it is necessary for helping you to heal your heart, mind, and soul. You can get more stories, guidance, insights, and more grief support on the Grief Refuge app, which I hope you've already downloaded, but if not, you can download it now on your phone's app store. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, please be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.